September 1st, 1870. A French emperor stands on a ridge. Below him, 100,000 of his own soldiers are surrounded. The fog is so thick he can barely see 20 meters ahead. But he doesn't need to see. He already knows. He whispers 5 words. Words no one was supposed to hear. This ground will be our grave. Within 24 hours, Napoleon III will do something no French ruler has done in 800 years. He will surrender himself, personally, to an enemy commander. He will hand over his sword. He will watch his empire collapse. And he will spend his remaining years in exile, replaying this single morning over and over in his mind. But here's what makes this story different from every other military defeat you've heard about. Napoleon III didn't stumble into this trap. He walked into it. Eyes open. Warnings ignored. 3 separate chances to escape, thrown away. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand exactly why. You'll see how the most powerful nation in Europe destroyed itself. You'll watch a new empire rise from the ashes, crowned in a French palace, surrounded by mirrors that reflected the death of one world and the birth of another. And you'll learn a lesson about leadership that no school will ever teach you. The lesson cost France everything. Might save you. If you're drawn to the raw edges of history, the unfiltered truths that shaped our world, consider subscribing for more like this. Give it a like if it resonates and drop a comment with where you're watching from. I'd love to see the global crew diving deep with me. Now let's go back to that fog-covered ridge, because what happened next changed Europe forever. The hills of the Ardennes rose under a dim, bruised morning sky. The kind of sky that seemed to whisper the outcome long before the first orders were given. Mist clung to the valley. Heavy, unmoving, thick as breath on cold glass. Beneath that mist, the French army of Chalons waited. Hungry, exhausted, shivering, surrounded. These weren't raw recruits. Many had fought in Italy. Some had served in Algeria. They knew what battle felt like. They knew the weight of a rifle, the sound of artillery, the smell of gunpowder mixing with blood. But they had never faced anything like what was coming. Napoleon III had positioned himself near the ridge overlooking the town of Sedan. His uniform was immaculate, gold buttons polished, medals arranged with precision, every detail perfect. His posture told a different story. He stood slightly hunched, shoulders drawn forward, hands clasped behind his back so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He was 52 years old but looked older, much older. A man worn down by something heavier than age. He had ridden out before dawn to survey the field. Now he could see almost nothing. The valley had become a gray void. Shapes moved in the fog, his own soldiers presumably, but he couldn't tell formations from shadows. His officers clustered behind him, whispering, arguing, offering assessments that contradicted each other every few seconds. The Prussians are positioned to the east, sire. No, the main force is northwest. The eastern units are Bavarian. We should attack before the fog lifts. Attack where? We can't see the enemy. Then we retreat toward Mézières. The route is blocked. Scouts confirmed it an hour ago. Napoleon III listened to all of it. He responded to none of it. He already knew what his officers were slowly realizing. There was no good option left. To the east, Prussian infantry held the high ground. Thousands of rifles waiting behind earthworks and fallen trees. To the west, Bavarian regiments had blocked the only viable retreat route. They had marched through the night to seal the gap. To the north, the Meuse River cut off any hope of escape. Too deep to ford, too wide to bridge under fire. And somewhere in the fog, though none of them could see it yet, hundreds of German artillery guns had been rolled into position during the night. Krupp steel breech loaders, the most advanced field guns in the world, capable of firing faster, farther, and more accurately than anything France possessed. The trap was complete. Napoleon III exhaled slowly, a thin breath that fogged the morning air and disappeared. One of his generals approached. "Sire, what are your orders?" The emperor didn't turn around. "We wait," he said quietly. "We wait and see what God decides." God decided at exactly 5 o'clock. The first Prussian shell screamed out of the fog and exploded near a French supply wagon. The blast threw men sideways. Splinters of wood flew like shrapnel. Horses reared and screamed. Then came the second shell. The third. The 10th. The 100th. The bombardment didn't arrive with scattered blasts. It arrived with rhythm. Precision. The coordinated thunder of a single vast machine. The morning quiet shattered as if the sky itself had cracked open. Explosions rippled across the valley floor. Tents collapsed. Ammunition carts detonated in secondary blasts. Men scrambled for cover that didn't exist. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar. This wasn't random artillery fire. This was design. This was discipline. This was the product of a military system that had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. And France had never bothered to prepare at all. Here's what made the Prussian bombardment different from anything France had ever faced. The French still used bronze muzzle-loading cannons. The same basic technology Napoleon Bonaparte had used 60 years earlier. To fire, you loaded from the front of the barrel. You rammed the powder and shell into place with a long rod. You stepped back. You fired. You repeated. Slow. Dangerous. Inaccurate at long range. The Prussians used Krupp steel breech loaders. You loaded from the back of the barrel. You clicked the shell into place. You fired. You loaded again in seconds. Faster. Safer. Accurate at distances the French couldn't even reach. But the technological gap was only part of the problem. The real difference was coordination. French artillery batteries operated independently. Each commander made his own decisions. There was no central fire plan. No communication between units. Shells landed wherever individual captains thought they should land. Prussian batteries operated as a single network. Range corrections flowed from observation posts to gun crews through a relay of messengers and signals. Fire concentrated on specific targets. Supply dumps, command posts, troop concentrations, then shifted to new targets on schedule. It was the difference between a mob throwing rocks and an orchestra playing a symphony. One was noise. The other was destruction. Within 30 minutes, the French artillery had been largely silenced. Gun crews lay dead beside their pieces. Ammunition stores had exploded. Surviving batteries couldn't locate targets through the smoke and fog. The Prussian guns kept firing, and firing, and firing. Across the valley on the Prussian side, the scene was completely different. Helmuth von Moltke stood on a hillside with a leather map case open before him. He was 69 years old. Thin, pale, almost fragile looking. His uniform was simple, none of the decorations that French generals wore like armor. But his eyes were sharp, focused, calculating. He watched the bombardment through a telescope. Columns of smoke rising from French positions. Flashes of light where shells found targets. Tiny figures running through the haze without direction. His staff worked around him in crisp silence. Aides relayed range corrections to artillery commanders. Couriers carried movement orders to infantry divisions. Engineers updated maps with the latest reconnaissance. No shouting. No confusion. No conflicting orders. Just a system operating exactly as designed. This was the culmination of 30 years of planning. Rail timetables calculated down to the minute. Mobilization protocols rehearsed until they ran like muscle memory. Supply chains mapped across hundreds of miles. Officer training standardized through the general staff system. War, to Moltke, was not a contest of passion. It was not about glory or honor or the romantic charge of cavalry across an open field. It was a calculation. And France had never done the math. He lowered his telescope. One of his aides approached with a report. The French artillery is largely suppressed, sir. Infantry remains in defensive positions. No organized counterattack observed. Moltke nodded slightly. High command appears disorganized. Yes, sir. Moltke turned back to the valley. Smoke drifted across the hills. The sound of explosions rolled like distant thunder. They are not disorganized, he said quietly. They are defeated. They simply haven't realized it yet. Behind him, a courier arrived on horseback. Mud splattered across his uniform. He saluted quickly. "Sir, the Crown Prince is ready." He asks if he should begin the infantry advance. Moltke closed his map case with a sharp snap. "Yes," he said. "Let us close the ring." The German armies began to move. 3 waves, dozens of brigades, hundreds of companies stepping forward like parts of a single organism. Their boots struck the ground not in perfect unison. This was no parade, but with the steady determination of men who knew their cause, their place, and their purpose. Prussian infantry from the east, Bavarian infantry from the west, Saxon units from the north, all converging on the valley where 100,000 French soldiers huddled under bombardment. From his position on the ridge, Napoleon III watched the advance begin. Dark shapes emerging from the fog, lines of men moving with terrible patience, bayonets glinting when the occasional ray of sunlight broke through the clouds. He turned to his officers. Their faces told him everything. The arguments had stopped. The contradictory advice had stopped. Now there was only silence. The silence of men watching a disaster unfold and knowing they cannot stop it. Napoleon III looked back at the valley. Somewhere down there, his soldiers were dying. Men who had trusted him. Men who had marched to war because their emperor told them France would be victorious. He had promised them glory. He had delivered them into a trap. But here's what no one standing on that ridge understood yet. This disaster didn't begin on September 1, 1870. It didn't begin when the first Prussian shell fell. It didn't even begin when France declared war 2 months earlier. The seeds of Sedan were planted 20 years before, in decisions that seemed wise at the time, in warnings that were ignored, in a name, Napoleon, that became both a blessing and a curse. The emperor standing on that ridge wasn't just fighting Prussia. He was fighting the ghost of his own uncle. He was fighting expectations he could never meet. He was fighting an empire built on memory instead of reality. And the man across the valley, Moltke, had spent 3 decades preparing for exactly this moment. He possessed a weapon France never suspected. Not a gun, not a cannon, something far more powerful. A system. To understand how 100,000 French soldiers ended up surrounded in that valley, you need to go back. Back to the choices that sealed their fate. Back to the 3 chances Napoleon III had to prevent this disaster. He ignored every single one. And the reasons why will change how you think about power, preparation, and the price of living on borrowed glory. Napoleon. The name itself was a prison. When Louis Napoleon Bonaparte first came to power in 1848, he carried something no other French politician possessed. A name that echoed through history. A name that reminded every French citizen of glory, conquest, and empire. His uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte, had once made Europe tremble. He had crowned himself emperor. He had redrawn the map of the continent. He had turned France into the most feared nation on earth. Then he lost everything at Waterloo. Now, decades later, the nephew was trying to resurrect what the uncle had built. But here's what Louis Napoleon never understood. His uncle earned the name through victory. He inherited it through blood. An inheritance is not the same as achievement. When Louis Napoleon declared himself Emperor Napoleon III in 1852, the French public expected miracles. They expected military triumph. They expected France to dominate Europe once again. Napoleon III tried to deliver. He launched wars in Crimea, Italy, and Mexico. Some succeeded. Some failed catastrophically. But none of them built what France actually needed. Railroads, factories, a modern military system. Instead, Napoleon III built palaces. He renovated Paris with grand boulevards. He constructed opera houses and monuments. He hosted lavish balls where the aristocracy danced beneath crystal chandeliers. France looked magnificent. France looked powerful. But underneath the golden surface, the foundations were crumbling. Here's the part that history books often skip. While Napoleon III was building monuments to French glory, Prussia was building something else entirely. Railroads. Not decorative railroads for wealthy passengers. Military railroads. Strategic railroads. Lines designed specifically to move troops and supplies faster than any army in history. By 1870, Prussia had over 11,000 miles of coordinated rail networks. Every line connected to every other line. Schedules were synchronized. Loading procedures were standardized. An entire army could move from Berlin to the French border in less than 3 weeks. France had railroads too, but they weren't coordinated. Different companies owned different lines. Schedules conflicted. Connections failed. Moving troops from Paris to the eastern frontier was a logistical nightmare. But the railroads were only the beginning. Prussia had something France couldn't even comprehend: the General Staff. If you've never heard of the Prussian General Staff, you're not alone. It's not the kind of thing that appears in dramatic paintings or heroic statues. It's boring, administrative, bureaucratic, and it was the deadliest weapon of the 19th century. Here's how it worked. In France, military planning depended on individual generals. Each commander developed his own strategies. Each officer trained according to his own methods. When war came, everyone improvised. Sometimes improvisation worked brilliantly. Sometimes it failed completely. There was no consistency, no coordination, no system. Prussia took the opposite approach. The General Staff was a permanent planning body. Hundreds of officers worked year-round, not fighting wars but preparing for them. They studied maps. They analyzed logistics. They conducted war games simulating every possible scenario. Every Prussian officer trained according to the same doctrine. Every unit followed the same procedures. When orders came from headquarters, everyone understood them immediately because everyone had learned the same language. Moltke, the quiet, calculating commander watching the bombardment at Sedan, had run this system for decades. He didn't need to be a battlefield genius. He didn't need to inspire troops with dramatic speeches. He needed to build a machine. And he did. The Prussian army wasn't a collection of regiments loyal to individual commanders. It was a single organism. Every part connected. Every movement coordinated. Every decision flowing from a central intelligence. France never built anything like it. France didn't even understand why it mattered. But here's where the story gets painful. Napoleon III had 3 separate chances to prevent the disaster at Sedan. 3 moments where he could have changed course. 3 warnings he chose to ignore. The first chance came in 1866. Prussia went to war against Austria. The 2 German powers had been rivals for decades. Now they would settle the question of dominance once and for all. The war lasted 7 weeks. 7 weeks. Austria, one of the great powers of Europe, was crushed so quickly that the rest of the continent couldn't believe the reports. The decisive battle at Königgrätz lasted a single day. Austrian forces were shattered. The Habsburg Empire was humiliated. And France did nothing. Napoleon III watched from Paris. His advisors urged him to intervene. Prussia is growing too powerful, they warned. If you strike now while their army is engaged, you can check their expansion. Napoleon III hesitated. He didn't want war. He wanted negotiation. He wanted to position France as the arbiter of Europe, the wise power that balanced all others. So he waited. By the time he decided to act, the war was over. Prussia had won. Austria had surrendered. The moment had passed. First chance. Gone. The second chance came in 1867. Bismarck, the Prussian chancellor, understood that France was nervous. A powerful Prussia threatened French dominance. Something had to be done to ease tensions. So Bismarck offered a deal. Luxembourg. The small duchy sat between France and the German states. Bismarck suggested that France could annex it. A territorial gain that would satisfy French pride and demonstrate that Prussia respected French interests. Napoleon III was interested. His diplomats began negotiations. Then the French Parliament found out. The reaction was immediate. Outrage, accusations, political fury. The emperor is bargaining with Bismarck. France doesn't need Prussian permission to expand. This deal is an insult to French honor. The Parliament rejected the Luxembourg arrangement. Napoleon III, politically weakened and desperate to maintain support, accepted the rejection. He walked away from the table. Bismarck noted the failure carefully. He filed it away. He understood something important. France's political system was fractured. The emperor couldn't make decisions without parliamentary approval, and the parliament was driven by emotion, not strategy. This weakness could be exploited. Second chance. Gone. The third chance came in July 1870. And this time, Bismarck didn't just wait for France to make a mistake. He manufactured one. The crisis began with the Spanish throne. Spain needed a new king. One of the candidates was a German prince, Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, who had family connections to the Prussian royal house. France was horrified. A German prince on the Spanish throne? Prussia to the east, a Prussian ally to the south? France would be surrounded. Napoleon III demanded that Leopold withdraw his candidacy. The demand was reasonable. Leopold agreed. He withdrew. Crisis over. Or so it seemed. But the French parliament wasn't satisfied. They wanted more. They wanted Prussia humiliated. They demanded that King Wilhelm of Prussia personally guarantee that no Hohenzollern would ever seek the Spanish throne again. Wilhelm refused. The demand was insulting. He had already allowed Leopold to withdraw. He would not grovel. The French ambassador met with Wilhelm at the resort town of Ems. The conversation was polite but firm. Wilhelm declined to make further guarantees. The ambassador departed. A routine diplomatic exchange. Then Bismarck got involved. He received a telegram describing the meeting. The original text was measured, respectful, professional. Bismarck edited it. The edited version, the EMS dispatch, made it sound like Wilhelm had rudely dismissed the French ambassador. Like Prussia had insulted France deliberately. Like war was the only honorable response. Bismarck released the edited telegram to the press. France exploded. Crowds filled the streets of Paris screaming for war. Newspapers printed furious editorials. Politicians competed to sound the most patriotic. To Berlin. To Berlin. Napoleon III knew the army wasn't ready. He knew the logistics were a mess. He knew Prussia had better artillery, better railroads, better planning. But he also knew something else. If he refused to fight, he would lose his throne. The parliament was clear. The public was clear. France demanded war. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. Bismarck had won before the first shot was fired. Third chance. Gone. Think about this for a moment. Every decision that led to Sedan was avoidable. Napoleon III could have intervened in 1866 when Prussia was vulnerable. He could have accepted the Luxembourg deal in 1867 and reduced tensions. He could have resisted the war fever in 1870 and demanded more time to prepare. 3 chances. 3 off-ramps. 3 moments where a different choice would have changed everything. He took none of them. What? Because Napoleon III was trapped. Trapped by a name he couldn't live up to. Trapped by expectations he couldn't meet. Trapped by a political system that rewarded emotion over strategy. He wasn't fighting Prussia. He was fighting the ghost of his uncle. And ghosts don't negotiate. Here's what this means for you. Have you ever made a decision because of how it would look rather than whether it was right? Have you ever ignored a warning because admitting the problem would make you seem weak? That's the Napoleon III trap. Success built on image instead of foundation. Confidence built on reputation instead of preparation. It works until the moment it doesn't. And when that moment comes, everything collapses at once. France looked powerful in 1870. France felt powerful. French generals boasted that they would march to Berlin within weeks. They couldn't even reach the border without chaos. The mobilization began on July 15th. Within days, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Soldiers arrived at train stations to find no trains waiting. Trains arrived at depots to find no soldiers ready. Equipment went missing. Supplies vanished. Regiments couldn't locate their commanders. One division spent 3 days searching for its artillery. Another discovered that its ammunition had been sent to the wrong city. A cavalry unit arrived at the front with horses but no saddles. Officers wrote desperate letters to Paris begging for basic necessities. The replies took days, sometimes weeks, sometimes never came at all. Meanwhile, across the border, the Prussian machine operated flawlessly. 380,000 men mobilized in 18 days. Every soldier transported by rail according to precise timetables. Every unit equipped according to standard checklists. Every commander in position according to the master plan. Moltke didn't hope his army would be ready. He knew it would be, because he had built a system. And systems don't depend on luck. They don't depend on individual genius. They deliver consistent results because every piece is designed to work together. France had no such system. France had tradition, pride, the memory of past glory. None of those things moved trains. By August, the French army had finally assembled near the eastern frontier. But it was already too late. The Prussians had moved faster. They had positioned their forces in a wide arc. They were not simply facing the French. They were surrounding them. Napoleon III sensed the danger. He ordered a retreat toward the fortress city of Metz. But the retreat was chaotic. Units got separated. Communications broke down. What should have been an organized withdrawal became a stumbling flight. The Prussians followed. They caught up with the French at a series of bloody battles. Spitzeren, Worth, Marzlar. Each engagement followed the same pattern. French soldiers fought bravely. French commanders made courageous decisions. And French logistics failed completely. Ammunition ran out. Reinforcements arrived late. Artillery couldn't coordinate. The French kept losing. Not because they lacked courage. Because they lacked systems. By late August, the army was split. One portion was trapped at Metz under Marshal Bazaine. The other portion, the army of Chalons under Marshal MacMahon, was ordered to march east and rescue Bazaine. Napoleon III joined MacMahon. It was the worst decision of his life. Because the Prussians knew exactly where they were going. Moltke had read the French plans. His cavalry had tracked their movements. His telegraph network had coordinated his armies. He didn't chase MacMahon. He waited for him. At a small town called Sedan. The morning of September 1, 1870, began with fog and ended with fire. By the time the mist lifted, French soldiers could finally see what they had only suspected. They were completely surrounded. The hills encircling the valley were covered with enemy forces. Prussian infantry to the east. Bavarian regiments to the west. Saxon units to the north. Everywhere they looked, gray uniforms, glinting bayonets, the dark shapes of artillery batteries. A complete encirclement. A steel ring with no gaps. And at the center of that ring, 100,000 French soldiers waited to die. But here's what the textbooks never explain. The French didn't simply collapse. They didn't run. They didn't surrender immediately. They fought. They fought with a desperation that impressed even their enemies. Individual units launched attacks that had no chance of success. Officers led charges knowing they would not survive. Soldiers stood their ground under bombardment that would have broken lesser men. The problem wasn't courage. The problem was that courage alone cannot defeat coordination. Every French attack ran into the same wall. Prussian infantry fired from prepared positions. Prussian artillery adjusted fire within minutes. Prussian reserves moved to plug any gap before the French could exploit it. It was like punching water. Every blow landed. None of them mattered. Marshal MacMahon had commanded the army of Chalons. He was a veteran of decades of warfare. He had fought in Algeria, Crimea, and Italy. He knew what battle looked like. He had never seen anything like this. By 6 o'clock in the morning, he was wounded. A shell fragment struck his thigh as he rode near the front lines. Blood soaked through his uniform. His aides carried him to a farmhouse behind the lines. Command passed to General Ducrot. Ducrot assessed the situation instantly. He understood what was happening. He understood that the army was trapped. He understood that only one option offered any hope of survival. Retreat. Immediate retreat. Westward. Toward the town of Mézières. Abandon the baggage. Abandon the wounded if necessary. Get the army out before the ring closed completely. He issued the order. Regiments began to move. Units shifted westward. For a brief moment there was a chance. Then General Wimpfen arrived. Wimpfen carried a letter from Paris. The letter gave him command of the army in the event that MacMahon was incapacitated. McMahon was incapacitated. Wimpfen was now in charge. And Wimpfen had a very different idea. He had arrived only hours earlier. He hadn't seen the bombardment. He hadn't watched the encirclement close. He believed, based on reports from Paris, that the army was strong enough to break through the Prussian lines. Not retreat. Eastward. Toward Kerrigan. Smash through the Prussian center and link up with Bazaine at Metz. He issued his own order. Now there were two orders. Ducrot had told the army to move west. Wimpfen had told the army to move east. Both orders went out simultaneously. Both reached different units at different times. Chaos followed. Regiments that had begun retreating stopped. Regiments that had been preparing to retreat began advancing. Units collided with each other on narrow roads. Officers screamed contradictory instructions. Nobody knew who was in command. Nobody knew which direction to go. The army froze. And while it froze, the Prussian artillery kept firing. Here's the tragedy buried in this confusion. Both generals were right. Ducrot was right that retreat was necessary. The army couldn't survive inside the ring. Every hour they stayed increased the casualties. Wimpfen was right that attack might be the only option. By the time he arrived, the western route was already closing. Bavarian units were moving into blocking positions. Retreat might already have been impossible. The truth was simpler and more terrible. There was no good option. The army was doomed before either general gave a single order. The decisions made in Paris weeks earlier, the chaotic mobilization, the confused strategy, the political pressure that forced Napoleon III eastward, had sealed the outcome. Ducrot and Wimpfen were arguing about how to rearrange chairs on a sinking ship. The ship was going down regardless. By mid-morning, the French attempted to break the ring. General Marguerite commanded the cavalry reserve. He was ordered to lead a charge against the Prussian positions near the village of Floing. Smash through the line. Create an opening. Give the infantry a chance to escape. Marguerite gathered his horsemen. These were some of the finest cavalry in Europe. Cuirassiers in polished breastplates. Chasseurs in green jackets. Hussars in bright blue. They had been trained for exactly this moment, the glorious charge that would turn the tide of battle. They formed up in long lines. They drew their sabers. They advanced. Marguerite rode at the front. As they approached the Prussian positions, a bullet struck him in the face. He fell from his horse, mortally wounded. His men kept going. The charge struck the Prussian infantry like a wave against rocks. Horsemen slashed at soldiers crouched behind hedgerows and stone walls. Sabers clanged against rifle barrels. For a few terrible minutes, the fighting was hand-to-hand. But the Prussians held. Their rifles fired at close range. Horses screamed and collapsed. Riders tumbled into the mud. The charge broke apart into isolated struggles. The cavalry fell back. They reformed. They charged again. And again. And again. 12 separate charges that morning. 12 waves of horsemen hurling themselves against prepared positions. Each time they were driven back. Each time they left more dead behind. A Prussian officer watching the carnage reportedly said, "Ah, the brave men." Bravery wasn't enough. By noon, the cavalry was destroyed. If you're still watching, you understand something important now. This battle wasn't lost because French soldiers were cowards. They were heroes. They charged machine guns on horseback. They attacked uphill against artillery. They died by the thousands trying to break a ring that couldn't be broken. The battle was lost because courage without systems is just sacrifice. The battle was lost because France sent its army to fight a 19th century war using 18th century methods. The battle was lost in Paris. In the rail yards. In the planning offices that didn't exist. In the coordination that was never built. Sedan was where France paid the price. But the bill had been written years before. Through it all, Napoleon III wandered the battlefield. His officers had begged him to stay behind the lines. Too dangerous. Too exposed. An emperor shouldn't risk himself this way. Napoleon III refused. He mounted his horse and rode forward. Into the smoke. Into the chaos. Into the dying. He wasn't looking for tactical opportunities. He wasn't trying to command. He seemed to be looking for something else entirely. A bullet, perhaps. Soldiers who saw him that morning described a strange sight. The emperor riding slowly through the carnage. His uniform still immaculate. His face empty. His eyes focused on nothing. Some officers thought he was trying to inspire the troops. Others thought he was trying to get himself killed. One witness later wrote that Napoleon III seemed like a man, already dead, searching for a grave. He stopped occasionally to speak with wounded men. He asked about their homes, their families. He apologized for their suffering. The soldiers didn't know what to say. What do you say to an emperor who has led you into a trap and now weeps beside your stretcher? By 2 o'clock, the situation was hopeless. General Wimpfen launched his attack toward Karagin. 12,000 men advanced eastward against the Prussian center. They made it less than a mile. Prussian artillery shredded the advancing columns. Infantry fire from prepared positions cut down entire companies. The attack stalled, fragmented, and collapsed. Wimpfen retreated back to Sedan. Meanwhile, Ducrot's western retreat had been blocked completely. Bavarian forces held every road. There was nowhere left to go. The army began to dissolve. It didn't rout. A rout implies movement, panic, flight. This was something different. This was paralysis. Soldiers simply stopped fighting. They gathered in clusters, behind walls, in ditches, under trees. They sat down. They stared ahead. They waited. Officers lost contact with their commands. Messengers couldn't find the generals they were looking for. The chain of command disintegrated like wet paper. Reports flooded back to Napoleon III. The artillery has exhausted its ammunition. The cavalry no longer exists as a fighting force. The infantry cannot be reorganized. We cannot hold another hour. Napoleon III sat on a folding camp stool near a farmhouse. His breathing was shallow. His face was gray. For a long time he said nothing. He was thinking about history. About his uncle, who had surrendered only after years of war, only after every option was exhausted, only after Waterloo itself. His uncle had fought to the end. Could he do less? He looked at the valley below. The smoke. The scattered bodies. The clusters of men who had no orders and no hope. These were his soldiers. They had trusted him. They had marched east because he commanded it. They were dying because he had failed to prepare. His uncle had sacrificed armies for glory. Napoleon III made a different choice. "Send up the white flag," he said. An officer hesitated. "Sire?" "The white flag," Napoleon III repeated. "Now." Another officer tried to protest. "Perhaps General Wimpfen can organize." Napoleon III stood. His voice was quiet but firm. "This army has suffered enough. I will not see it destroyed to satisfy pride, my own or anyone else's." A white cloth was fastened to a pole. A messenger mounted a horse and rode toward the Prussian lines. The firing slowed, then stopped. Silence settled over the valley. The silence was almost worse than the bombardment. It meant the battle was over. It meant France had lost. It meant everything was about to change. Napoleon III looked around at his officers. Some were crying. Some were furious. Some simply stared at the ground. "I have made my decision," he said. "I will take full responsibility. The army surrenders. I surrender myself." He paused. "France will need someone to blame. Let it be me." The next morning, September 2, 1870, Napoleon III rode to meet his conqueror. The meeting took place at a small weaver's cottage near the village of Donchery. King Wilhelm I of Prussia was waiting. Beside him stood Bismarck, the man who had engineered this entire war. Napoleon III dismounted slowly. He was wearing the same uniform from the day before, still clean, still covered in medals. His face was calm. His posture was straight. But everyone present could see the truth. This was a broken man. He approached Wilhelm and spoke the words that ended an empire. "Sire, I come to place myself in your Majesty's hands." Wilhelm received him courteously. The Prussian king was not a cruel man. He understood the weight of this moment. An emperor surrendering, a dynasty falling, a nation humiliated. They spoke briefly. Arrangements were made. Napoleon III would be taken to a castle in Germany as a prisoner of war. Not a dungeon, a castle, with servants and gardens and every comfort, but a prison nonetheless. As Napoleon III was led away, Bismarck allowed himself a small smile. Everything had gone exactly as planned. In a single day, France had lost 17,000 killed and wounded. Another 21,000 had been taken prisoner. The army that surrendered at Sedan totaled over 83,000 men, soldiers, officers, generals, and an emperor. It was the largest military surrender in European history up to that point. But the war wasn't over. Bismarck had defeated the French army. Now he would defeat France itself. And he would do it in the most humiliating way possible, by crowning a German emperor in the palace of the French kings. That moment was coming. And when it arrived, it would reshape Europe for the next 75 years. The news reached Paris before the government could prepare for it. September 3, 1870. Telegrams arrived. Newspapers printed special editions. Word spread through the streets like wildfire. The emperor had surrendered. Napoleon III was a prisoner. The army was destroyed. For a moment, Paris went silent. The cafes emptied. The boulevards cleared. People stood in doorways and on balconies, reading the headlines over and over, unable to believe what they were seeing. Then the silence broke. Rage exploded across the city. Crowds gathered outside government buildings. Workers flooded in from the eastern districts. Students marched from the Latin Quarter. Everyone was shouting. Everyone was demanding answers. Where is the Empress? Who is responsible? The Empire has betrayed us. By the evening of September 4th, the Second French Empire was dead. Empress Eugenie fled the Tuileries Palace through a side entrance, escaping the mob by minutes. Republican politicians seized control of the government. A new French Republic, the third in less than a century, was proclaimed from the steps of the Hôtel de Ville. The empire that Napoleon III had spent 18 years building collapsed in less than 18 hours. But here's what the cheering crowds in Paris didn't understand. The war wasn't over. It was about to get much worse. Bismarck had no intention of stopping at Sedan. Defeating the French army was only the first step. He needed something more. Something permanent. Something that would transform the German states from a loose coalition into a unified empire. And he knew exactly how to get it. He would march on Paris. He would surround the city. He would starve it into submission. And then, when France was utterly humiliated, he would crown the King of Prussia as German Emperor. Not in Berlin. Not in Munich. Not in any German city. In Versailles. In the palace of Louis XIV. In the heart of French glory itself. The Prussian armies advanced. By September 19th, Paris was completely encircled. 300,000 German soldiers surrounded the city. Siege guns were positioned on the heights. Supply lines into Paris were cut. 2 million people were trapped inside the walls. The siege had begun. The first weeks were almost bearable. Paris had stockpiled food before the encirclement. Warehouses held grain. Cattle had been driven into the city. Parisians believed that the siege would be brief. Surely the new government would organize relief armies. Surely the provinces would rise up. Surely someone would come to save them. No one came. The relief armies that formed in the south and west were poorly equipped and badly led. They marched toward Paris with courage but without coordination. The Prussians defeated them one by one. October passed. November arrived. The weather turned cold. And the food began to run out. Here's what the history books rarely describe in detail. Starvation doesn't arrive suddenly. It creeps in slowly, day by day, meal by meal. First, the bread rations were cut. Then cut again. Then again. The price of meat tripled. Then it disappeared entirely. Butcher shops that once sold beef and pork began selling horse. Then they sold donkey. Then rat. The zoo animals were slaughtered. Elephants. Camels. Even the beloved pair of elephants named Castor and Pollux were killed and their meat sold to wealthy restaurants. Cats disappeared from the streets. Dogs vanished from their owners. By December, a rat cost more than a day's wages. Fuel vanished alongside food. Coal shipments couldn't enter the city. Families burned their furniture to stay warm. Then they burned their floorboards. Then they had nothing left to burn. The cold killed as many as the hunger. Hospitals overflowed. Medicines ran out. Doctors performed surgeries without anesthesia because there was none left. Children died first. Then the elderly. Then everyone in between. The city that had once been the light of Europe became a tomb. But Paris refused to surrender. This is the part that still amazes historians. The logical choice was obvious. Negotiate. Accept terms. End the suffering. The people of Paris chose defiance instead. They organized a national guard of armed citizens, over 300,000 strong. They built new cannons in city workshops. They launched desperate sorties against the Prussian lines trying to break through. Every sortie failed. The Prussians were too well prepared. Their trenches too deep. Their artillery too accurate. French attacks were cut down before they reached the German positions. But the Parisians kept trying. They sent messages out by balloon, hot air balloons that drifted over the Prussian lines, carrying dispatches to the outside world. Over 60 balloons launched during the siege. Some made it. Some were shot down. Some drifted off course and landed in enemy territory. They sent messages in by pigeon, carrier pigeons that flew back into the city with microfilm dispatches tied to their legs. The Prussians trained hawks to intercept them. It was communication by desperation. And still no relief came. Meanwhile, something remarkable was happening at Versailles. The German princes had gathered in the palace of the Sun King. Bismarck had summoned them. The King of Bavaria, the King of Württemberg, the Grand Duke of Baden, princes and dukes from across the German lands. All of them assembled in the palace that symbolized French supremacy. The irony was deliberate. Bismarck understood symbolism. He understood that politics was theater. He understood that crowning a German emperor in Versailles would send a message that echoed through history. France had dominated Europe for 2 centuries. That era was ending. Germany was rising. And the French would witness their own humiliation from their own palace. But there was a problem. King Wilhelm I of Prussia didn't want to be emperor. This seems impossible. Who refuses a crown? Wilhelm did. He was 73 years old. He had been King of Prussia for 9 years. He was comfortable with his title. He understood his role. Emperor was something different, something grander, something that frightened him. The title carried echoes of the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling, chaotic institution that had collapsed decades earlier. Wilhelm worried that emperor sounded too ambitious, too aggressive, too French. "I am King of Prussia," he told Bismarck. "That is enough." Bismarck disagreed. The Chancellor understood that Germany needed more than a military alliance. It needed a symbol, a unifying figure, a single ruler who represented all the German peoples, Prussians, Bavarians, Saxons, and the rest. Without an emperor, Germany would remain a confederation. With an emperor, it would become a nation. Bismarck spent weeks persuading, cajoling, and maneuvering. He bribed the King of Bavaria with a secret pension. He negotiated special privileges for the southern states. He worked behind the scenes until every obstacle was removed. Finally, reluctantly, Wilhelm agreed. He would accept the crown. January 18, 1871. The date was chosen deliberately. Exactly 170 years earlier, the Kingdom of Prussia had been proclaimed. Now, on the same anniversary, the German Empire would be born. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles filled with uniforms. Prussian blue, Bavarian white, Saxon green, Württemberg red. Generals and princes from across Germany stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the glittering chandeliers. Above them, the ceiling paintings depicted the glories of Louis XIV, the Sun King conquering his enemies, France triumphant over all of Europe. Now those paintings looked down on a very different scene. Bismarck stood at the front of the hall. He wore his military uniform. He always preferred to look like a soldier rather than a politician. In his hands he held a single sheet of paper. The room fell silent. Bismarck read the proclamation aloud. "We, Wilhelm, by the grace of God, King of Prussia, do hereby declare the German Empire restored." The words echoed off the mirrors, multiplied, reflected. 100 versions of the same voice speaking the same declaration. When Bismarck finished, the Grand Duke of Baden stepped forward. "Long live His Imperial Majesty Kaiser Wilhelm." The hall erupted. "Long live the Kaiser. Long live the German Empire." The shouts bounced off the mirrors, off the gilded walls, off the painted ceiling. It sounded like 1,000 voices, 1,000,000 voices, the voice of a new nation being born. Wilhelm stood stiffly, accepting the acclaim. His expression was difficult to read. Pride perhaps. Discomfort certainly. A man who had never wanted this moment now living it. Behind him, through the tall windows, the frozen gardens of Versailles stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those gardens, Paris was starving. The siege lasted 135 days. By the end of January, Paris had nothing left. The government, now led by Adolphe Thiers, finally accepted the inevitable. Negotiations began. Terms were discussed. Bismarck was not gentle. France would pay an indemnity of 5 billion gold francs. An astronomical sum. More money than most nations possessed. France would surrender Alsace, the province that had been French for 2 centuries. Gone. France would surrender most of Lorraine, including the strategic city of Metz. Gone. German troops would occupy portions of France until the indemnity was paid. German soldiers walking French streets. German flags flying over French towns. And there was one more humiliation. German troops would parade through Paris. On March 1, 1871, the Victory Parade took place. 30,000 German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées. They passed under the Arc de Triomphe, the monument Napoleon Bonaparte had built to celebrate French victories. They marched in perfect formation, their boots striking the cobblestones in rhythm. Parisians watched from behind closed shutters. The streets were empty. The cafes were closed. The city that had resisted for 4 months now fell silent in shame. Some Parisians wept. Others turned away, unable to watch. A few shouted insults from upper windows. But most simply stood in silence, witnessing the death of French supremacy. The parade lasted only a few hours. The German troops withdrew to their camps. Within days they began marching home. But the damage was done. France would remember this humiliation for generations. The Treaty of Frankfurt was signed on May 10, 1871. It formalized everything. The territorial losses, the financial burden, the occupation terms. France signed because it had no choice. But here's what Bismarck didn't anticipate. Humiliation breeds revenge. As the French delegates left the treaty signing, one of them reportedly muttered, "This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years. He was almost exactly right. 43 years later, France and Germany would go to war again. A war that would kill millions. A war that would destroy the German empire Bismarck had built. A war that would reshape the entire world. The seeds of 1914 were planted in 1871. But that's a story for another video. If you're seeing European history in a completely new way right now, if you understand how one battle, one surrender, one crowning can reshape everything that follows, share this video with someone who needs to see it. And subscribe with notifications on. Because the forces that shaped our modern world don't stop at Sedan. They echo through decades, through wars, through revolutions. The next video goes even deeper. As for Napoleon III, he never saw France again. The Prussians released him after the treaty was signed. He traveled to England to a small estate in Chislehurst. His wife joined him. His son joined him. They lived quietly. A family in exile. An emperor with no empire. Napoleon III spent his final years writing, defending his decisions, explaining his choices, trying to make sense of what had gone wrong. He still believed he had been right to seek peace at Sedan. He still believed that surrendering saved tens of thousands of lives. He still believed that the alternative, a massacre, would have been worse. Perhaps he was right. Or perhaps he was simply a man trying to find meaning in failure. On January 9, 1873, Napoleon III died during surgery. He was 64 years old. His last words were reportedly a question about the siege of Sedan. Even at the end he was still there. Still standing on that ridge. Still watching the fog lift. Still counting the guns that surrounded him. France didn't mourn him. The Third Republic had no use for a fallen emperor. His death was noted in newspapers and quickly forgotten. But the consequences of his reign, the war, the defeat, the humiliation, shaped France for decades. And the empire born in the Hall of Mirrors would shape Europe even longer. The story could end here. A fallen emperor. A risen empire. A continent transformed. But there's one more thing you need to understand. One final lesson that makes everything else meaningful. Because Sedan wasn't just a battle. It wasn't just a surrender. It wasn't just a crowning. It was a warning. A warning about the difference between looking powerful and being powerful. A warning about the cost of ignoring preparation. A warning about what happens when image meets reality. And that warning still applies today. Years after the war ended, veterans of Sedan gathered to remember. They met in small cafes, in regimental associations, in quiet corners where old soldiers swapped stories that civilians couldn't understand. They talked about the smoke, the confusion, the sound of Prussian shells falling without end. They talked about comrades who died beside them, officers who led hopeless charges, horses that screamed and fell. But most of all, they talked about the silence. The strange, terrible silence that fell when the white flag went up, when the guns stopped firing, when everyone realized at the same moment that it was over. That silence haunted them. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of transformation. The silence of a world ending and another beginning. One veteran described it this way: "We had been soldiers of an empire. When the firing stopped, we were prisoners of a ruin. The change happened in a single breath. One moment we were France. The next moment we were nothing." Here's what that veteran understood. Sedan wasn't destroyed by Prussian artillery. Sedan was destroyed by decades of neglect. The shells that fell on September 1st, 1870, didn't create the French defeat. They revealed it. They exposed the rot that had been growing for years. The outdated artillery. The chaotic logistics. The fractured command structure. The political system that rewarded spectacle over substance. All of it had been there, hidden beneath parades and monuments and the glittering surface of empire. The Prussian bombardment simply stripped away the illusion. And that's the lesson history buried. Napoleon III wasn't destroyed by Malta. He was destroyed by the gap between who he pretended to be and who he actually was. He pretended to be his uncle, the great Napoleon, the conqueror of Europe, the military genius who bent the continent to his will. He actually was something else. A politician, a diplomat, a man who preferred negotiation to warfare and spectacle to substance. There's nothing wrong with being a politician. There's nothing wrong with preferring peace. But Napoleon III couldn't admit that's who he was. He couldn't escape the name he carried. He couldn't tell France, "I am not my uncle. I will lead differently." So he pretended. He built monuments to military glory while neglecting the actual military. He hosted parades that looked impressive while the army rusted from within. He declared war on Prussia because his parliament demanded it, not because France was ready to fight. He performed strength. He never built it. Here's why this matters to you. Have you ever performed success instead of building it? Have you ever focused on how things looked rather than how they worked? Have you ever ignored warnings because admitting the problem would shatter the image you'd constructed? That's the Napoleon III trap. And it's everywhere. Businesses that spend more on marketing than product development. Leaders who manage perception instead of performance. People who invest in appearance while their foundations crumble. It works until it doesn't. And when it fails completely. Not gradually. Not gently. All at once in a single catastrophic collapse. That's what happened at Sedan. That's what happens whenever image collides with reality. Now think about the other side. Malta didn't win because Prussia was braver than France. French soldiers were incredibly brave. They charged artillery on horseback. They died by the thousands in hopeless attacks. Malta won because he built a system. 30 years of preparation. Rail networks designed for military movement. Officer training standardized across the entire army. planning exercises conducted year after year until coordination became instinct. None of that was glamorous. None of it made for exciting paintings or dramatic statues. But when the war came, the system worked. Prussian armies mobilized in 18 days. French armies stumbled for weeks. Prussian artillery fired with coordinated precision. French artillery operated in isolated fragments. Prussian commanders followed standardized doctrine. French commanders improvised contradictory orders. The outcome was determined before the first shot was fired. This is the choice every person, every organization, every nation eventually faces. You can invest in appearance, or you can invest in foundation. You can perform competence, or you can build it. You can look ready, or you can be ready. You cannot do both equally. And when the crisis comes, when the fog lifts and you see the guns on every hillside, only one of those investments will save you. France chose appearance. Prussia chose foundation. 83,000 men surrendered at Sedan because of that choice. An empire fell because of that choice. A continent transformed because of that choice. Think about where you are right now. In your career, your business, your relationships, your life. Are you building? Or are you performing? Are you preparing for the challenges ahead? Or are you hoping they never arrive? Are you investing in systems that will work when everything goes wrong? Or are you trusting that things will somehow work out? Napoleon III trusted that things would work out. He believed French courage would overcome German preparation. He believed the name he carried would somehow translate into victory. He was wrong. And he spent his final years in exile, replaying September 1st, 1870, wondering what he could have done differently. You started this video knowing that France lost a war in 1870. Now you know why. Not the surface answer. Not Prussia had better guns. The real answer. The structural answer. You understand that Napoleon III wasn't a fool. He was a man trapped by expectations he couldn't meet and systems he couldn't fix. You understand that the French army wasn't defeated by cowardice. It was defeated by decades of neglect disguised as confidence. You understand what happens when appearance collides with reality. And you'll never look at success the same way again. Before you go, I need you to do something. If this video changed how you see history, or how you see power, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's building something. Someone who's leading something. Someone who might be falling into the same trap Napoleon III fell into. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every video on this channel is designed to show you history the way it actually happened. The truth behind the monuments. The lessons buried in the battles. The next video is already in production. I'll see you there.